Welcome to this little video about the new additions that I have done for the DEMoCap motion capture tool, as well as for the gine exporter scripts, in order to simplify the usage of the program for situations where you usually do not have a full game-ready model at hand. So let's first start with this example. I've got here an example character, which is based on one which I've used for testing before. So this is the normal situation you have. So when you start out, you usually have a model which has a texture, which has a rig and stuff like this. But in some situations, you start out with less than that, maybe just a model with a rig, and you just want to animate it, or your texture is created for a different program and just not directly fitting for DEMoCap. So what this means is the following. You have usually the model, and you would then start out with the skin which you have created. So that's the skin which is used here. It has 4 textures. So there are 2 situations which can happen. You don't have a skin yet, or you have a partial skin. So I will first start with the situation that you have no skin yet. So let's remove that, and you are with this. Usually, if you would have the previous version of DEMoCap, you would now have nothing. Because you have no skin, the model has nothing to render. So it would be totally invisible, which is a little bit annoying if you start out with a model and you don't have a skin. So what has been added now is the support for default skin and the tint color for the default skin. So the idea is the following. Every skin, every texture in your model which does not have a match in the loaded skin is now automatically replaced with this default skin. And if the skin supports tinting, you can choose the color. So, for example, something like this. So I leave it at that for the moment. So you could technically also choose your own default skin, but if you load a new character, you will get the default skin preset with a gray tint color preset, so that when you load your model, you already see something. And if you just want to make a motion capture and you don't need the texture of the model, then you can already stop there and just start using it with a placeholder texture with a placeholder color to speed up the process. It can also happen you have already a skin, and this is something that happens in game development, especially with the gine game engine a lot, that you can use a partial skin. A partial skin means that you have only of those 4 textures some defined, for example, only these 2. And the other textures are empty on purpose because you define them dynamically in an element class using replacement textures, or you define them at runtime. So it is often the case that you have a texture which is not a skin, which is not fully defining all textures on purpose. So let's load this partial skin. This one. So you see, this happens. In the old version of DEMoCap, everything that is green would have been invisible. With the default texture, just everything that is not defined will be replaced. So if you have a partial skin in your project, you can just load it into DEMoCap, and what is not part of the skin will be just replaced with a default color. Now, let's see if we can choose something like this. Yeah, a little bit of that. So I will go back to the green one, so it's easier to see that you have a partial skin. So you can now use both systems. Either you don't have a skin at all, or you have a skin with or just only partially defined, and DEMoCap will fill in the rest with the default. So you have then, for example, something like this. So you can easily start with a model and just use a default skin. And if this is enough for your task, we can go on. Or if you have a partial skin, you can use this one too. So I didn't stop just at the character because there have also been users which wanted to just quickly load set pieces without needing to deal with a texture. So like, for example, we can use that wall here. Let's copy that and let's add a new static prop. So we have then a static prop. So let's say, let's say you started out with that prop and you wanted just to load, for example, this one here. Usually if you do this and you have no skin, which matches, the object would be invisible, making it a little bit hard to work with when you need to create a skin. With the changes now, you get instead the default skin, which is marked here with the default color. So, and you also don't need this one. You could leave it empty, that doesn't matter. And you could say, okay, I just load the model. I give it some kind of, just let me say, blah, 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 pure, something like this. Well, it's a little bit too dark to see. Something like this. So, and you can quickly give a color to your mesh. So if you just want to have a set piece to do motion capture with and you don't care about the skin, you can now just take an object, load the model, adjust quickly the color, and you can get going. So that is the change about default skins. What I have also changed is the handling of rigs. So far, DEMoCap had a little bit of problem if you tried to use a rig which does not define collision shapes, then you could not click on an object to select it. And this has been adjusted now so that if there is no rig, for example, it will use the enclosing box as collision shape so that you at least can click on something. And let's make a top of this one. So, and let's go back to this guy here, head character. Let's take this one and use it here. So that's now an object with the same model as this one here. So if we don't have a model and don't have a rig defined, then it will take now an enclosing box around the entire mesh. So you can at least click on something. But there can be also more if you have, for example, let's go to config. So let's take this one here, which is a rig which does not define any collision shapes. Then usually could not be able to click on it, but it's a new change. It will take the collision, the rig, and if it detects if there are no collision shapes, it will make a copy of the rig and set it to mesh collision or the model collision. So you can still click on every small detail on it. Model collision is not very friendly performance-wise, but in this case, it helps to avoid the situation that you load a model, click away on it, and oh, you cannot click it anymore because it doesn't have a collision shape. So in both situations, you have no rig or a rig without collision shapes, you will now be able to click on it. So these are basically the changes that has been done on the DEMoCap side to make life a little bit easier. Now there are also changes to the export scripts for Blender to deal with a problem which popped up in the recent times. So let's start with that blend file for the same model. And let's do a little modification. So the drag engine expects your model to have one UV map because that's the default. You have your model, you have your texture with the texture coordinates, and that's it. But sometimes there are situations where, especially if you have models created for a different engine, for a different render, or even for something like Blender, it can happen that you have more than one UV map. And so far, this caused problems with the exporting because the export script was not fully precise or fully correct with multiple UV maps. So what has been changed now? First, the exporting has been adjusted to work properly with multiple UV maps, and the default, the base map selection has been modified. So let's first add a UV map and let's give it something, like for example, reset everything. So then we have here a totally different texture mapping than this one here. So the problem with Blender is it doesn't have an ordering for UV maps. So I can't say, oh, default is the first you've ever defined. So I will take this as the base UV map. This doesn't work. So to fix this, under the object panel, under the drag engine model, you have now the base UV map selection. So if you have more than one UV map, you can now select which one is your base UV map, which the first one that you have added usually selected by default. So what means base UV map? Drag engine, as mentioned, says a model has one UV map, or how it call it, a texture coordinate set. And if you have more than one, then these are called additional texture coordinate sets. And the base UV map is thus this UV map, which will become the default UV map for your model, and all others become additional UV maps. So in this case, we leave it at a default, and we will just export it as a delete me. So let's go back and have a look at it. This should be the same as before, just that we have now two texture sets. The game engine will use the first one. Technically, it's possible also for additional ones, but they are currently not used since there is no need for it. But it's there for future expansion. So you can now have easily export models with multiple UV maps without breaking the loading of the model. So let's have quickly the second one. I just have to make sure that I have loaded the correct model. Yes, because loaded models are kept in cache while running unless not used anymore. So let's now switch to the second UV map. So the second UV map becomes now the default, and the one which we are seeing here becomes the second. So if we export this one, we will now see that we have the same model, but we have now the other texture set which becomes the default. And then it looks like this one here, simply because the second one became now the default. So with this new option, you can select which of your texture map is the default one for using with a model. So you have now, first, no problems with exporting multi UV maps, and you can easily select which one is your main one, no matter how you name them. Naming is still important, which means the additional text, the names of the additional texture coordinate sets can be used later on in skins, for example, to select these texture maps. So yes, the naming has importance, but now it's not a problem anymore to select the base one because it is here. And a final change which has been done is how UV seams are handled. So far, the export scripts checked if you have no UV seams in your model. So not these red lines here. So if you didn't have any UV seam, it complained. To protect you from missing UV sets, UV seams and then having a model which has wrong rendering because UV seams are required to break up tangents while rendering. So this has been changed now to remove friction, in that the option you had here, which you could select to say that I have no UV seams, has been removed. But instead, the game engine will simply not complain, the export scripts will not complain anymore if you have no UV seams, but simply takes it as your choice. So should you export a model and the tangents are broken up, which is usually seen as if the lighting on a model goes across such a boundary and it goes haywire, then that usually means that you forgot to place UV seams. So now you will not be alerted by the export scripts that you have not added UV seams. But this helps for those users who just want to export a model and they do not care about UV seams and they do not have to deal with this warning and find this checkbox to switch the warning off. So by default, it's now disabled. And the user is responsible to know if he needs UV seams or he doesn't need it. So these are the new changes in the DEMoCap and the export scripts to make your life easier when working with a program and to speed up the projection process. So with this, have a nice day.